The consumer. The more she eats, the hungrier she gets. This is the premise of a student film Jonathan Byers pitches in the final season of Stranger Things, in which an insatiable cannibal stands in for capitalism. It's a goof concept mentioned offhand near the very end of the show, amid many Easter eggs and other meta jokes, but for some reason, this one has stuck with me more than anything else in the time since the series came to a close. Maybe the show is portraying Jonathan as a bit of a clown here, the pretentious, idealistic film student flip side to Erica, the hyper-capitalist of Season 3. I don't think the show is really trying to make a statement about capitalism one way or the other, but one has to simply think for 2 seconds about the world this joke was dropped into to see the irony in it. Stranger Things has been, pretty much since its explosive debut season, the apex of hyperconsumption in the film and TV industry, doing for streaming and the binge model what Jaws did for theatrically released movies. Not only is it a textbook case of a self-contained miniseries stretching its scope far past its original intent and becoming a full-blown franchise due to its unexpected success and the profit potential for its production company, but it's a show built on references to products, a show whose characters' identities have been inseparable from consumer goods since the start. The very episode in which Jonathan delivers this joke about the consumer played in theaters, not just the Netflix-owned and coastal independent theaters, but the AMC chain, which is significant considering the hard line Netflix typically draws against theatrical release. The only other Netflix movie that screened at AMC prior to this year was Glass Onion, a move that was not repeated for the new Knives Out movie. But the Stranger Things fan event, in addition to K-pop Demon Hunters and In Your Dreams, all of which released this past fall, happens to be a calculated move in Netflix vying for ownership of Warner Discovery. This is to say, the very exhibition of the episode referencing the consumer is proof in and of itself that Netflix is hungry, and the more it eats, the hungrier it gets. But was this joke solely intended as a subliminal jab from the Duffer Brothers towards Netflix, towards the company that has brought them immense fame and fortune? Is it possible that the double entendre of Jonathan's film is even more literal? That in fact, the consumer is the average Stranger Things viewer who gorges on 8 to 10 hours of TV in one sitting, or inconveniently broken up across 3 holidays, immediately hungry for more? Hashtag ConformityGate, the conspiracy theory that there's a hidden episode or even full season of the show, certainly does us no favors in beating the consumer allegations. So are the Duffers wearing their contempt for the viewer on their sleeves here? I think we're too early into this video to answer that question definitively, but as I work my way through this final season, keep this question in mind. Is the joke on us? When the first season of Stranger Things came out, I was roughly Nancy and Jonathan's age, which put me between the ages of these actors and these actors. That part's still true, because we've all aged in the real world, but the characters are stuck in this chamber of time in which supposedly only 4 years have passed between this and this, between this and this. It's been a joke since before even the 4th season came out, how much older the actors are than their characters, but it's somehow even more pronounced in this final season, and to be honest, I can't think of an image that better encapsulates the state of the show at this point. We have all physically grown and changed in the past decade, but when Stranger Things is on, we are psychically forced back into the role of a child. While it's no secret that my relationship with the show has waned the longer it's gone on, this is the first season that's been, rather than a sanded down version of a thing I once enjoyed, an unmitigated disaster. And for what it's worth, I don't think the season ever stood a chance. Endings, in general, are hard, whether it's the final installment of a film franchise, the final season of a TV show, or even the last 20 minutes of a movie. This is the hardest thing to nail because you are faced with the consequences of your earlier narrative decision-making. In the middle of a story, you're able to play around, dig up surprises, present mystery boxes, and put your characters through dynamic experiences. Endings are where you're faced with the bill for all that fun, and if you didn't budget accordingly, you fall on your ass. You have to shoehorn characters into conclusions you maybe realize you didn't lay the groundwork for. In other departments, you may realize you laid too much groundwork and no longer have the real estate to see it all through. Think of the end of Game of Thrones, when the complex web of alliances and enemies flattens into good versus bad. Characters take sudden turns that are incongruent with everything we've seen from them because the story needs to end somewhere, and all the obstacles thrown at the characters are overcome with almost uncomfortable ease, because it's too late at that point to keep complicating things. Game of Thrones is a pretty notorious example of a series nosediving, but even something much more warmly received by fans, like the last Harry Potter movie, upon more recent revisiting, I find surprisingly flat. People like to rag on the 7th movie as Harry Potter goes camping, but At least the characters were actively working through stuff in that movie, having their principles challenged and relationships tested. The last movie is essentially one big final battle tying up loose ends, and that kind of installment I think is just fundamentally disengaging. But here's the thing. The last Harry Potter movie is 2 hours and 10 minutes long. That's about how long the last episode of Stranger Things is, and there's an additional roughly 8 hours worth of final battle gearing up to it. I'm gonna make one more comparison before we get into the meat and potatoes here. There's a moment in the hit film X-Men Apocalypse, where the kids walk out of Return of the Jedi, another culprit of these final installment shortcomings, and Jean Grey says, "Well, at least we can all agree the third one's always the worst." A cheeky nod to the fact that this is the third movie in its own cobbled-together trilogy. It also struck me back then as a self-deprecating defense mechanism, preempting the comparison to bad third movies by simply making it before the critics got a chance to. That movie was actually, I think, largely the product of Stranger Things' success, indulgently basking in 80s media, so you can imagine where my mind went when in season 5, Steve and Dustin start talking about Return of the Jedi.
You've all seen Return of the Jedi, I hope?
Yeah, it's the one with the teddy bears.
Ewoks.
Yeah, it's the best one.
Is it?
No, but every child loves it, so tracks.
This might be a stretch, but I think the Duffers are, if maybe subconsciously, attempting the same defense mechanism, well aware that this season is the Return of the Jedi of Stranger Things. In the place of Ewoks, we have third graders. So what are we looking at here, really? On one hand, we have a totally flat endgame speedrun devoid of character in which everyone collectively does exactly what the plot requires of them.
That's endgame.
On the other hand, we have a smorgasbord of new lore to get through in order to make sense of Vecna and the final boss of the Upside Down. In this ill-fated balancing act, Season 5 finds itself in a strange limbo where it both retains the bloat that characterized Season 4, stretching certain narrative elements past their breaking point to pad the runtime, and struggles to afford itself the runtime to explore all this new material. Stick around, and we'll see how this thing crash-landed into an ending that only left fans hungry for more. From here on out, this video will contain heavy spoilers, but for once, I'm confident that if you're watching this video, you either have already seen the new season, or simply don't care. Either way, proceed with caution. And if you don't know, I have a Patreon where you can access hours and hours of bonus content, be it podcast-style recaps of everything I watched in a given month, film festival coverage, or reviews of specific patron-suggested films. Huge shout out to the patrons here, and that could include you. Head on over to patreon.com/TaylorJWilliams and pledge today. Okay, so where this season picks up, a year and a half has passed since the big earthquake at the end of season 4, and the impending turmoil teased at when it seemed like everyone in Hawkins would soon become aware of Vecna and the Upside Down in some capacity has mostly subsided. The town is under military quarantine, as Robin informs us through some thinly veiled radio exposition, but to be honest, things are more or less business as usual, and the townsfolk don't seem particularly perturbed by anything going on. Our core crew, on the other hand, has essentially turned into the Wolverines from Red Dawn. That radio show Robin's taken over, at the now abandoned radio station The Squawk, is used as a means of the gang transmitting codes to each other to smuggle resources and coordinate crawls. What are crawls, you might not be asking? Well, the military, spearheaded by Linda Hamilton's Dr. K, has taken over the Upside Down and all official gateways to it. So, with Vecna still at large, the gang sends Hopper on these routine surveys of the Upside Down in secret to try and track him down. So far, the crawls have been fruitless. That is, of course, until the particular crawl the season opens on. Turns out this whole time, Vecna's been gearing up for the anniversary of Will's disappearance in season 1, when he plans to, I think, destroy the world? As Henry, he's donned the persona of Mr. Whatsit, an imaginary friend named after the character from A Wrinkle in Time, which a particular class of young Hawkinsians happen to be reading. He endears himself to the kids with the grand plan of using their energy as a big battery or something to crash one dimension into another. Chief among these kids is Mike and Nancy's little sister Holly, who turns out to be Vecna's first victim. Going back to that crawl, there's a lot of moving parts, so naturally things go awry, and basically the gang is split up into a few factions for the rest of the season, slowly piecing together Vecna's ultimate plan and formulating their own to save the kids and stop him for good. As I alluded to before, we are pretty much in a sustained third act for the majority of the season, and the results are exhausting. A fun exercise is watching the first episode of the show and then immediately watching anything from like the season 4 finale onward. Seeing this go from a story about a bunch of kids and oddball townsfolk figuring out a supernatural mystery to all-out guerrilla warfare is startling, to say the least. And it's true that in any show, jumping from the first to the last episode is bound to be a jarring leap in character development, but I think there's something a bit more extreme about going from
starch and cellulose
to
Are you crazy? My parents are here.
I think it's easy to see in this stark contrast the amount of Flanderization, shark jumping, and anti-upping into oblivion that has gone on as the show blindly stumbles its way into any sort of feasible landing position. Remember how scary the Demogorgon was in Season 1? Man, sure don't want to run into that thing. Then in Season 2, there was the Mind Flayer, which basically made the Demogorgon look like a punk-ass bitch. Then there was Vecna, and suddenly the Demogorgon was basically a slightly stronger attack dog. I don't want to get too caught up in power level itself as a priority here, but I think this comparison speaks to the way this show constantly provides the illusion of increasing stakes, when really it's just running around in a circle. I talk a lot on this channel about the shepherd tone, the auditory illusion that a tone is constantly ascending, even though it's actually just cycling back and repeating every time it hits the octave. It's used in music to sustain a sense of ramping up tension, and I like to compare it to shows that have to constantly outdo their world-ending threats. Stranger Things is no exception. This time around, it turns out the Upside Down itself is but one piece of a larger interdimensional ecosystem, and there's basically an Upside Down squared under the Upside Down. Basically, the quote-unquote Upside Down, as we've known it, is really just a wormhole to this alpha dimension, which is what Vecna is using the kid's energy to crash into Earth. Actually, I say Earth, but in Dustin's interdimensional diagram, Earth is really just Hawkins. I don't know why, but I find this detail very funny. But this is still functionally just the original Upside Down, reskinned and made to seem like a bigger threat. The Upside Down itself serves the same function for the Abyss as the gates did for the Upside Down. And likewise, the military operations are functionally just the Hawkins lab, reskinned and made to seem like a bigger threat. Dr. K is quite literally a Dr. Brenna replacement, and we'll talk more about her later. The Mind Flayer was the Demogorgon but bigger, then Vecna was the Mind Flayer but smarter, and now we've circled back to the Mind Flayer, who's, I guess, been pulling the strings all along. Like zooming out of a fractal pattern, these elements intended to raise the stakes don't make the show feel bigger, they just make everything that came before them feel smaller. The temptation is understandable as a story nears its end to make every element as fraught as possible, but there are some truly unforgivable instances of jumping the shark here. Take, for instance, the arc of Karen Wheeler. In the season's opening episode, the Wheeler house gets attacked, and Karen single-handedly faces off against a Demogorgon to protect Holly using nothing but a wine bottle. Later on, she throws an oxygen tank into a dryer and blows up a pack of Demodogs. I know the show has brought more and more characters into the know with each season, and since season 3, there has been an inherent cartoonishness to the antics, but this really feels like it's a bridge too far, even on the show's own terms. There's a scene later on where Holly feels like a coward for not attacking the Demogorgon with a fire poker, and Max comforts her saying,
"You're smart. You honestly think that you could have stopped those monsters with a fire poker?"
And like, maybe the wine bottle didn't stop it, but it sure did a lot more damage than a bunch of nails, barbed wire, and a Molotov cocktail did. They recycle the same exact mom versus Demogorgon face-off. At least when Joyce goes protective mom mode, it comes from a familiarity with the Upside Down. She's been navigating this thing since the start. Dropped into a situation she doesn't have the context to understand, Karen's hypercompetence seems to fully erase the already smeared sense of regular people overcoming their human limitations to defeat these supernatural enemies. Apparently it's not as hard as we thought. And I'll be circling back to the Wheelers, by the way. I'm realizing in the edit that this scene actually happens in the cold open of the second episode, which picks up immediately where the first episode leaves off, saving the climax for when we've already pressed play and signed up for another hour of TV, doling it out in flashbacks. I was gonna hold off about ranting about the binge model in this video since I have other videos where I do that, but I had to point this out. Beyond the action antics feeling like complete self-parody at this point, the show has leaned even more heavily into homage and references. Just from my initial viewing and note jotting, I caught nods, both explicit and implicit, to Back to the Future, Return of the Jedi like I talked about, Indiana Jones, and Ghostbusters and the Terminator again.
I was kind of just going for like a bit of like a Belushi thing, but if he was in like a Hughes film.
While pulling from other non-80s media like A Wrinkle in Time, obviously, Minority Report in this bathtub scene, Jurassic Park in that Demodog scene, Harry Potter in the Tom Riddleification of Vecna in the Upside Down, Game of Thrones in this impenetrable wall in the Upside Down, Alice in Wonderland, and I think they even riff on Zodiac with this top-down car shot. But it's not just the volume of references, it's the importance with which they're treated in the plot. Max is still in a coma from the end of season 4, and Lucas plays Kate Bush's running up that hill for her to give her an anchor in hopes of her coming to. The first few times this happens, the scene cuts away just as the song is picking up. And I took from this that the show and the characters were presumably just as tired of the song as we are after the significance it had in the previous season and the insanely viral second wind it received as a result. I figured they were playing it just enough to honor the character as they've set her up at this point, but taking steps to avoid oversaturation. Eventually, I was proven dead wrong. Turns out they were actually building up to a moment later in the season when Max finally escapes the Vecna mind prison responsible for her coma, and they do this whole big orchestral rendition of the song that is pretty much just a rehash of her big moment from season 4. One can imagine the experience of Max for the entire year and a half between seasons, stuck in a cave and forced to listen to her favorite song over and over again. This prison of nostalgia, as representative of what watching Stranger Things is like at this point. Pop quiz. Name the single best use of running up that hill in film or TV. If you said Placebo's cover in the pilot episode of The Vampire Diaries, you answered correctly. Give yourself a pat on the back. What Max's medical dependence on this song signals is that, in a broader sense, what was originally a novelty has turned into literal life force, both of the characters and of the show. In the early seasons, when the characters would whip out their Dungeons & Dragons manuals to make sense of nearly unexplainable happenings, you know, the titular strange things, it was a fun novelty that characterized the way they think about the world, showcase their creative tactics, but as the seasons have progressed, it seems more and more that the mechanics of the Upside Down and its inhabitants literally function according to the laws of physics of their D&D counterparts.
The curse. Vecna's curse.
Sometimes trusting their dungeon guide intuition comes back to bite the gang in the butt, but more often than not, they're pretty much completely on the money. That alternate dimension connected to Earth via the Upside Down is basically where all the evil things really hang out, and if the gang destroys the Upside Down, they can seal off that dimension for good. This is a massive change to our understanding of the Upside Down, vital for the story to have a sense of finality, but we are too late in the game to really get into the potential complications it may pose. So for the sake of brevity, the characters just compare it to the concept of the Abyss in D&D.
The Abyss.
Any particular reason?
A realm of pure chaos and evil.
I'm sorry?
D&D.
Jesus Christ.
The physics teacher, Mr. Clark, takes it at face value, and it's thenceforth decreed in Stranger Things lore that this is literally just the Dungeons & Dragons Abyss. I'm not sure if I'm really hammering my point here, but the final boss, the final realm of the final boss, is just plucked straight from the game and nobody bats an eye. More than ever, references are not just the flavoring, but the very DNA of the show. And it's in such explanations as that of the Abyss that the Duffers ultimately prove themselves to be a one-trick pony. Or I suppose each of them is a half-trick pony, you know, if the two of them make up one trick. Perhaps the biggest instance of flanderization is how impossibly out of hand the explanation sequences have become. Again, since the start of the show, characters have used media like Dungeons & Dragons to illustrate what they believe to be going on. A series of analogies. This season, though, pretty much every other scene is someone going, okay, stay with me. This toy is the Demogorgon, and this toy is us. All we need to do is pull the ripcord, Demogorgon goes boom, Bob's your uncle. Actually, I hate to do this, but I did encounter an Instagram reel that parodies these explanations better than I ever could. Here's a little snippet.
Okay, this is Star Wars, and this is the Death Star, and this is the wormhole. The worm? But the wormhole. Wait, worm? The early bird catches the worm. We could start before
If we don't wait too long.
And if we long it to go, then going to Vecna's lair!
To communicate the concept of resuscitating a Demogorgon with electricity, do we need to see Lucas have a eureka moment watching a bag of microwave popcorn? This is a concept as old as at least Frankenstein, which is also referenced.
You want to Dr. Frankenstein a dead demo.
Surely one could have thought of this on their own. But see, the popcorn analogy provides an excuse to linger on a sequence where the gang is munching on fun 80s snacks. That's justified by the plot, and furthermore, ties the entire Demogorgon resurrection plan back to a product, subliminally lingering in the back of our minds. And sure, we technically don't need anything ever. Half the fun of any show or movie lies in indulgence. But again, there's so much ground to cover here. A sequence like this feels, like I said earlier, like the Duffers are just padding the runtime, kicking the can and shifting the responsibility of answering the bigger questions they open up away from themselves. For instance, what's the deal with this goo Nancy and Jonathan encounter? Supposedly it has something to do with the exotic matter hanging above the lab in the Upside Down, but why did it Indiana Jonesify these soldiers, yet Jonathan and Nancy lie unharmed in it? Why does it suddenly harden up on them? I swear I'm not a plot hole guy, but we spend an entire episode in the goo, and it goes completely unquestioned. And I can already hear some of you, oh, you complain that the Upside Down has lost its mystique, yet you demand an explanation for the goo. Curious. But the goo doesn't add any more mystique to the Upside Down. That genie's already out of the bottle. All it does is add a superficial obstacle to the episode that the writers simply don't bother to justify artistically. This is what I mean when I say the season hangs in this limbo. On one hand, it seems as though we are receiving explanations ad nauseum. On the other hand, looking back, it doesn't feel like anything was properly explained, because all those explanation sequences were describing total bullshit that could have been communicated in 2 seconds. Robin has this convoluted record sequence to convey that Max is trapped in Vecna's mind palace, which, call me crazy, I thought they already knew. Meanwhile, the Mind Palace itself is scattered with bits and pieces from Vecna's backstory, which we see about as little of as physically possible, while still maintaining the semblance of a cohesive narrative. But like, showing us Henry opening this briefcase with this rock and becoming corrupted doesn't actually explain what's going on here. Who's this scientist? How'd he wind up down here? Why is a lone Boy Scout digging around in these caves? And what exactly is the rock? Related, Vecna's entire motivation is shifted onto the Mind Flayer, who was just using Henry as a vessel. But what's the Mind Flayer's motivation? Let me guess. The Mind Flayer is an idea, and the more he eats, the hungrier he gets. The truth is, there's a dubious explanation for the lack of questions answered. It's called an extended universe, complete with a Vecna origin story play and at least one spin-off in the works, which supposedly connects to this rock that is given like 5 seconds of screen time in the finale, but is apparently responsible for the events of the entire franchise. The show is constantly dancing around expansive lore as lightly as possible so as to entice us with more content, and I use that dirty word deliberately. In the middle of the final stretch, when the story is presumably at its most tense, Max drags 11 through Vecna's mind, which takes them to the Hawkins High School back when Henry and everyone's parents were in school. She alludes to various juicy details we could explore in the high school, and then says,
I wish we had time to sightsee, but we've got a play to catch.
What a cleverly written piece of marketing, because as it so happens, all these relationships are exactly what we see in depth in the real-life play. The more Stranger Things we watch, the more Stranger Things were being advertised. And to be honest, were it not for this very thorough and well put together breakdown of the West End and Broadway shows, I think half of the stuff that happens this season would have gone over my head. Shout out to that guy. But see, whether things get explained sufficiently or not isn't the problem, because even if the lore were airtight, at this point, any and all mystique or intrigue from the Upside Down is completely vanished. We know exactly how it works now, and it's startling how logical it all is. When Holly wanders out of Mr. What's-Its house, she worries because
Henry will return to his house soon, and when he does, he cannot know that you're gone.
But like, this entire realm exists within the consciousness of a supernatural being. Why are we beholden to the real-world physics of if he's not literally in the room, he can't see what's happening? Why is it treated like Mr. What's-It is coming home from a 9 to 5? And this isn't the first time I've brought up how the Upside Down is more knowable than ever. Gone is the Lovecraftian terror of the unknown from early seasons, and instead, the characters are able to work through these concepts literally like physicists. But the difference this season is how much of a toll it takes on the characters. In the early seasons, they were learning stuff. There was a sense of trial and error, new discoveries, a tactile relationship with the Upside Down that instilled a sense of active discovery within us too. Now, I guess there are still new discoveries and some trial and error, but It's all sort of predisposed. The characters aren't learning so much as passively explaining, ostensibly to each other, but really, collectively, to us. This is to say, the characters are no longer characters. They are mere puppets, sounding boards for the Duffer Brothers to explain their convoluted logistics to the audience. It's all one big Rube Goldberg contraption, and each character is reduced to a simple machine. The way they talk in an ensemble rhythm, interrupting each other and finishing each other's sentences, alley-ooping each other to dunk their ultimate point, they are completely homogenized.
Explains why every crawl led to a dead end.
And why I can't find him in the bath.
Why Holly fell from the damn sky.
Yeah, but why is he taking kids up there?
For the same reason he took me. So when the Abyss and Hawkins collide, they become one.
He's remaking the world.
Gonna move worlds tonight.
Have I mentioned how much I hate your theory?
Me too.
Me three. I hate all of this.
For a show whose existential threat is turning people into a hive mind, the heroes have effectively turned into a hive mind themselves.
Hive mind.
A collective good versus the collective bad that is Vecna and the Mind Flayer and the military and all the other components of the Upside Down, or rather, the Abyss. There is no human experience here anymore. To overcompensate for this lack of pathos, this disinterest in character, the show develops a few creative tactics of its own. One is, as I've illustrated, the runtime devoted to hollow explanations. Another is the sheer violence on display. The show has slowly become increasingly graphic season to season, so maybe it's no surprise that this time around, the gore is off the charts, relatively speaking. But what's not a natural progression is how many people die. Not main characters, of course, but that Nancy supercut I did earlier, in the last 2 episodes, she's straight up mowing people down with a machine gun and not batting an eye. I know a year and a half has passed, but A, that's not that much time, and B, despite the teaser at the end of season 4 and the martial law situation, it's not like Hawkins has actually broken out into a war zone. There's no one in the Upside Down for the soldiers to attack, really, so there's no pretense for hostility. They're basically just conducting more tests. There was no situation in that time that could have prepared a normal-ass person like Nancy Wheeler to kill anyone, let alone this many people. And it doesn't seem to weigh on her at all. I know Nancy's always been trigger happy, but she's never had to actually kill someone, and I think that's a meaningful jump that we should see her emotional reaction to.
Nice shooting back there.
You too.
But the apex of this issue comes in the finale. Eleven is convinced she needs to sacrifice herself to prevent anything bad from happening again, and Hopper talks her out of it by saying,
Not like this. Not with more violence.
That's a very interesting choice of words, Hopper, because isn't the plan here to kill Vecna and blow up the Upside Down? And what happens 5 minutes later?
Not with more violence.
To say nothing of Hopper's hypocrisy in this scene, when he was fully prepared to blow himself up earlier this season.
And the bomb?
The bomb was... it was a failsafe.
You were planning to die.
I don't want to blow the Upside Down with us in it.
If he was meant to undergo some sort of character arc, that does not come through. So the logistical explanations are making up for the lack of character and story, and then the violence is making up for the lack of substance at the heart of those logistical explanations, and it all just becomes a total game of cinematic whack-a-mole. Who suffers the most from this? Let's look at Mike, our poor fallen from grace protagonist, who has little more to do this season emotionally than plan a pipe dream with 11. Similarly, Lucas has little more to do emotionally than sit next to Max with the Kate Bush boombox, and as a result, these two are basically the foot soldiers of the season. If Nancy is a super soldier, these two are the privates constantly sent into the trenches. Mike gets this crazy oneer where he's guiding a group through a battle on the military encampment. Meanwhile, Lucas sustains a gnarly injury leading these kids underground, and I'm sure the intent is for us to go, wow, look how much they've grown up. But these set pieces do not make up for the lack of emotional substance the characters are given. It is clear overcompensation. There's an effort to keep the spirit of Mike alive through Holly, who has much more going on this season than either of her siblings. As Vecna's first victim, she's sort of the call and response to Will being abducted in the first season. She winds up in the Vecna Mind Palace where she encounters Max, and there are multiple scenes where she'll do something and Max will say,
You're starting to remind me of your brother.
I take it back. You don't remind me of your brother. You are your brother.
You're a Wheeler.
It's very transparent what they're doing here. And while I understand what they're trying to do with Holly's journey rhyming with Will's, her arc is particularly startling because we basically haven't seen her grow up at all. She has not been a character in this show. Only 4 years have passed over the course of the show, so she has gone from baby to fully cognitive person completely in the background of all this stuff. But whatever. We'll call a retcon and move on. Because if anyone is the focus character this season, it's Will himself. The opening scene is this overly CGI'd sequence of a de-aged Noah Schnapp as Will back in season 1, getting pumped full of evil upside-down juice after the Demogorgon very unambiguously cedes the floor to Vecna. Speaking of retcons. But it makes some sense to focus on Will like they do this season. If Holly is a vehicle for history to repeat itself, centering Will becomes a means of breaking the cycle entirely, bringing season 1 full circle by showing his growth from victim to empowered adversary. And that empowerment has a bit of a double meaning. The explanation for Will going missing in season 1 is that Vecna recognized Will as weak and corruptible, a vulnerable vessel for him to operate through. So to close the loop, Will has to both physically and emotionally empower himself. The physical empowerment is handled simply enough. Will gets superpowers. And he's always had those goosebumps, supernatural clairvoyance to the creatures he came into contact with in the Upside Down, but now he finally harnesses them to become sort of the mirror image of Eleven. Actually, the literal mirror image. It was pointed out to me that he does the reverse of Eleven's hand movement when he uses his powers. But more important than his physical empowerment is his emotional empowerment. Since season 1, there's been a lingering thread that Will is different somehow. Back then, the show seemed to be hinting more at neurodivergence, but as the seasons have progressed, it's become clear that Will is wrestling with being gay, and in particular, having a crush on Mike. Vecna effectively threatens to out him, showing him a vision where everyone he loves turns him away once they learn the truth, so Will's real act of rebellion against Vecna, his declaration of agency, is coming out on his own terms, right before the finale. Channeling the entire arc of the Upside Down into this moment for Will is not entirely out of left field. His climactic confrontation with Vecna/Henry showcases the foil of someone embracing who they are versus someone falling eternally victim to their own repression. Henry, as we learn, was also a vessel of the Mind Flayer in the same way Will was, and while Henry is canonically attracted to women, there is a strong sense of repression baked into his backstory. But this foil shifts all the weight of the story to Will, who was never the main character to begin with, and I think this is single-handedly responsible for everyone else feeling like an empty shell at this point, for that hive mind sensation. As early as season 2, I've always found there to be a bit of an imbalance in the character scales once Will re-entered the picture. While he was the focus of the first season, the focus was on his absence, and with him physically gone in the present, we learn about the ensemble around him and how they step up to the task and represent him in aggregate. In season 2, with him back in the fold, he kind of took both the main character baton from Mike and the supernatural chosen one baton from Eleven, rendering them both a bit obsolete. Neither character is fully recovered from that feeling, and with the increased focus on Will this season, they are both even more of an afterthought. Mike is the heart, and Eleven is the muscle, as the show is established, but Will kind of performs the actions of both. Eleven has a perfunctory 1v1 against Vecna, but he was really already defeated in this psychic confrontation with Will. I'm realizing again in the edit that it's not even a 1v1 since Will does join in as well and save Eleven. You might think my focus on Will and Holly here contradicts what I said earlier about there being no characters, how everyone is just a simple machine, but actually, it doesn't. Aside from these big tentpole moments, Will is pretty much just chilling out while everyone else does the manual labor, and despite this confrontation with Vecna in the end, he's really not prominently featured in the finale. And neither's Holly for that matter. She has this whole arc of escaping the Mind Palace with Max, then she gets transported right back to where she began. None of this experience helps her out in the finale. There's a moment where it seems like her training with Max is of use as she herds the other kids into this cave that Vecna, for trauma reasons, is unable to enter, but then he just overcomes his trauma and keeps chasing after the kids. And that's when Will steps in and saves them. It really feels like, being the finale, the show realized it needed to center the season 1 protagonist again, and after everything I just talked about, they finally start to give Mike a little more focus. He's kind of the anchor character we check in with in each scene to set the emotional baseline of things, and he ties up the denouement in the finale's epilogue. But because he's been on the back burner all season, there's not much built up around him to really pay off, so all of this attention suddenly feels hollow. The ultimate result of all this latching onto one character and then unceremoniously dropping them and moving on to another is that rather than functioning like a proper ensemble piece, rather than surveying this collective and maybe highlighting the individual quirks and traits among them, the show is kind of just about no one in particular anymore. And I guess that leads me to how, like everyone else, but perhaps more unjustly, Eleven is totally shafted this season. She's posed with a moral dilemma, whether or not to self-destruct and prevent people like Brenna from creating more people like her, but this crossroads arrives pretty late in the game. Pondering a moral dilemma for 10 hours is not the most active busy work for a character, so she kinda dicks around for the first few episodes in hyper-militant mode, then she and Hopper dick around in the Upside Down for a bit, then they discover Kali, number 8 from season 2, which is where things finally pick up a little bit for them. We spend a few episodes getting to know Kali, learning her backstory, and seeing her vaguely allude to the fact that 11 has to die while both Hopper and the audience are sussed out. Turns out the rest of that gang from season 2 was murdered, and Kali's blood was tested to see if it could produce more people like her and 11, as Henry's blood facilitated for them. I don't know why they point blank killed everyone else but kept Kali alive for testing. For all they know, one of the others could have also had feasible blood, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. The real problem is how inactive 11 is during all of this. Even when things get interesting, it's interesting because Kali's explaining stuff to her, not because she's doing anything herself. Aside from Will boxing her out of her own story, I think this is also the consequence of resolving the Brenner conflict in season 4 and killing him off, of giving 11 a clear nemesis early on whose relationship with her cut to the core of her character, and then ending his storyline prematurely. And maybe there wouldn't have been enough space on top of everything else this season to have given Brenner sufficient time and attention, but again, that's partly because the Duffers spend so much precious runtime on slinky demonstrations. What we have instead of any sort of meaningful relationship with 11 is Dr. K, Linda Hamilton, Sarah Connor herself, whose stunt casting alone the show clearly hopes to mine a lot of goodwill from. I've said it since season 3, this show is at its worst when it has anything to do with the Terminator movies, and they must have learned all the wrong lessons. Dr. K is worse than just a limp character. She's barely an idea. She's an outline, a doodle of a character. There's actually something a little uncanny about Hamilton's performance, so clearly trying to express something, but given absolutely nothing to work with. Even in the finale, her soldiers mutinize against her, cutting her out of the picture even more. Had she been given more time and attention though, structurally, she was never going to hold a candle to Brenner. Brenner is the umbrella that unites 11 and Henry/Vecna/1/Mr. Whatsit, and with him gone, there's even less reason for 11 to be the one who faces off against him. So why not have it be Will instead? There's just a real missed opportunity to really show the bond between 11 and Henry. It's all touched on in dialogue and exposition. Apparently they have the same blood, unlike the other test subjects. Not really sure why.
Henry's blood. It's in me.
And that would have been a good thing to get into since, it motivates 11's whole suicide pact, but hey, what about that popcorn though? Even if they had offered some canon explanation for 11 being more biologically connected to Henry for whatever reason though, my point here is that when they do face off, they feel like complete strangers. Nothing feels resolved in these two finally clashing properly. One powerful thing arbitrarily beats another powerful thing, and the day is saved. That's probably why even Henry/Vecna, the supposed big bad of the entire show at this point, the arch-villain spanning generations, feels like an afterthought as well. I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record at this point, but it's crazy how even the most important characters manage to feel completely stagnant. We spend a lot of time in the Vecna Mind Palace, once again learning more lore that's alluded to in the play, but not spending time with him as a person. Most of the time he's on screen, he's in his Mr. Whatsit persona, which is all performance. We only get a few brief glimpses into what the character at his core is going through, and I think the lack of relationship with 11 really hurts in this department. Season 1 was not good because it humanized the Demogorgon. That's not the blanket standard I'm holding the show to, but the shift the story has taken since introducing Vecna is one of humanizing the Upside Down, giving him this tragic motivation, and all of a sudden, this season, it seems like they're no longer interested in exploring that. This is of course a gateway to the Stranger Things play, but we've already covered the play. Aside from Will, I guess Max is kind of his nemesis, the one he spends the most time battling at least, and she's more of a pest than anything more substantial to him. It's not like Vecna's doing much more than enacting his evil plan in season 4 either, since we mostly learn about Henry in flashbacks, but at least it feels like, as an antagonist, he is playing an active role in the story. Not only is Vecna's agency ultimately taken away when we learn that he's more or less at the mercy of the Mind Flayer, but as Mr. Whatsit, he feels incredibly disconnected from from the story. It doesn't help that the plan makes absolutely no sense. Why did he spend days coaxing Holly, only to take all the other classmates in one fell swoop? I know the failed rescue mission kind of gave him the opportunity to pluck them all at once and pretend he rescued them, but even if that hadn't happened, if he was adhering to the anniversary of Will's disappearance as a deadline, he wouldn't have had enough time to methodically entice each kid one by one anyway. And speaking of, why is he hellbent on doing this on the anniversary of Will's disappearance? Wait, what am I doing? See, you get so caught up asking all these dumb logistical questions that you lose sight of the fact that there's no actual story in front of you. At risk of recycling my holographic meatloaf comparison from my Now You See Me video, perhaps the most apt comparison to this season of TV is Collie's empty illusions. Vecna is kept at this vaporous distance the whole season, and he never feels like a tangible threat. Perhaps the lack of activity stems from the Duffers' desire to play things very safe across the board. The characters have essentially become childhood toys, things we don't really want to play with anymore, but can't bear to part with, so they're kept alive at all costs. The show's always played things safe. In Season 3, they killed off the most dispensable newish character, and in Season 4, they invented new characters to kill so none of the precious core ensemble would get hurt. But the final season is where you would expect some sort of bold risk-taking. Ultimately, the only characters who definitively die are the villain, and a character who had previously only appeared in one standalone episode of Season 2, completely siphoned off from everything else. There are fake-outs, sure. In a bit of shameless fan service, there's a fake-out Steve death that's completely empty. They make a token attempt to use this moment to tie up the Steve and Jonathan beef, but it very transparently only happened because of the memes about fan reactions to Steve dying. So clearly a tactic to generate word of mouth and tweets. Worse is the Wheelers' fake-out death. Ted gets a little more opportunity to shine in the opening episode than he usually does, leading me to think they were planning to kill him off at the end of the episode to raise the stakes and communicate that, Vecna's not playing around this time. When the Wheeler house gets attacked at the end of the episode and Ted gets slashed, I thought it was all falling into place as I had predicted. Then they also went for Karen Wheeler, and that caught me off guard. Suddenly I thought they were either overdoing it, or more likely, putting both parents through the ringer only to have them survive in the end. Sure enough, Mrs. Wheeler becomes OP and they both survive. What gets me is that, until the flash forward in the finale, Ted is completely out of the picture. Mike and Nancy don't even really pay attention to him in the hospital. It almost makes you think they did intend to kill him and chickened out last minute. But the worst fake out of all is Eleven's death, because it's not really a fake out so much as committing neither to killing her off nor to keeping her alive. The Duffers know they've played it safe up to this point, and they need some big moment of gravitas, a price paid for the victory won, so they have Eleven sacrifice herself to the dismay of everyone else. Then, at the end of the 45-minute epilogue, we're offered an alternate reality where Eleven is alive and vibing in, let's say, Ireland. Her death was an illusion cast by Collie so that she could escape and no one would be able to compromise her. Part of this presentation is some grandstanding, the stories we tell ourselves in order to live mumbo jumbo, but clearly this also gives them the ability to reap the benefits of both endings. They get the emotional weight of Eleven's death and the plausible deniability where she's still alive and our precious toy hasn't actually been destroyed. But guess what? Both realities are stupid. One requires Collie, who we last saw bleeding out and inches from death, surviving the entire time it takes Eleven to travel to the other dimension, defeat Vecna, bring the gang back, and drive into the real world, and for her to have the strength to craft this giant illusion, knowing exactly when and what to project. The other conclusion relies on Eleven on no real solid logical, or more importantly, emotional grounds, deciding the world is better off without her. We don't actually know that her blood is powerful enough to create more of her. We do know that Collie's blood failed too, which, if anything, indicates that Eleven is not that useful of an asset. And with all this uncertainty, why take such drastic measures? Is it really so far-fetched that, after getting out of this one situation, she could successfully go into hiding? I know I'm getting lost in the weeds again, but my point here is that the only reason for things to play out the way they do is so that the Duffers can have their cake and eat it. Aside from these fake-outs, the show goes to comically contrived lengths to keep the characters alive in any dangerous situation. Lucas is fine after getting the kind of Demogorgon slash that hospitalized Karen, which her hospitalization rather than instant death is already a contrivance in and of itself. There's this sequence where Vecna sends Demodogs after Max, and they conveniently decimate the soldiers escorting Robin out of the hospital before promptly leaving Robin and her girlfriend Vicky alone, because as Robin says,
They're not after us.
Okay, but then they weren't after the soldiers either. I guess the soldiers shot at this dog and that's why it attacked them, but it was charging them before they shot, and is it really able to discern who in this tight-knit group is the threat and who isn't? Would it not just attack all of them? But see, we by design don't know enough about how the Demogorgons and Demodogs think and react to be able to scrutinize their behavior, so they're free to operate however the plot needs them to in a given scene. As a result, there's not a single point where I genuinely believed any of these characters were in danger. And it's not that I need people to die to feel a certain level of dramatic buy-in to the story, but clearly the Duffers think I do, which is why they pull all these fake-outs and contrivances. While we're talking about Robin again, she's largely offset from the older teenagers, 20-somethings this season. She spends more time with Will than anyone else, as she's sort of shepherding him through coming out, and I understand why they're doing this, but the chemistry is all off. Something about this grouping, where Joyce overparenting is clashing with Robin liberating Will, is just not a fun group to be a part of. I guess that's not a very profound critique, but as I stated in my Season 4 video, one of the major draws of the show is seeing the different chemical equations of characters and their various groupings each season, and in this one, the vibes are just off. Maybe the reason boils down to Joyce. Poor Joyce. I know I lamented Mike as the fallen from grace protagonist, but Winona Ryder and David Harbour are the two top-billed cast members of the show, and they each have so little to do other than be concerned about their children. When Stranger Things first started, it was kind of a show for everyone. You had young kids, teenagers, and adults, each experiencing things specific to their age. They felt roughly the ages they're meant to be, and they came together and used the unique findings of their specific generational experiences to solve the mystery. Everyone was essential. Now the gap between the younger and middle generations feels much narrower, and the older generation is completely sidelined, so there's not really any specific experience to latch onto. It's all become muddled. I think Joyce is the single biggest casualty of this shift. And while she's given a big moment in the finale, she gets to say the one allotted fuck, it feels like the Mike one-er, where the show is overcompensating for how little she's given otherwise. First, she's overprotective of Will, then she goads Will into using his powers, then she feels bad about it, then she decapitates Vecna. That's more or less the extent of her arc. And this unimaginative approach to the characters' resolutions extends to the Nancy, Jonathan, Steve love triangle. Steve and Jonathan have a machismo off, then decide that Nancy is an independent woman and they should all just be friends. To be fair, the independent woman part is not entirely worked out between them, but they do talk about it in no uncertain terms.
You know, she's independent. She's got to get out there.
Really, the bulk of this conclusion comes from that incident in the goo I was talking about earlier, when Nancy and Jonathan decide to break up because they're both unhappy in the relationship. This part's a little emotional, but there are also some, batshit details of their relationship they gloss over.
I took your pink sweater to Goodwill.
What? I was looking for that.
You know I hate pink.
I know this is intended as a one-off bit, but really? I don't know, that's just a crazy thing to do. Everything else is so reasonable, and then they try to slide in this one bizarre detail. I don't know. I guess this part isn't so offensive. I was too busy thinking about the goo anyway. What Steve gets up to while they're having their heart-to-heart is having a heart-to-heart of his own with Dustin, who has become this season what we will deem Dark Dustin. Still mourning the loss of Eddie, the now brooding Dustin, complete with a Breakfast Club trench coat, is kicking up all sorts of trouble with the jocks at school who think Eddie was a murderer, and also projecting his relationship with Eddie onto Steve. They fight, they make amends, and I don't know. That's how I feel about all these characters' conflicts this season. They have an issue, then they talk it out, and it's resolved. It feels very easy and arbitrary. There's some minor external hiccups caused by the conflicts. Dustin and Steve fighting causes them to break their radio antenna, which causes Nancy and Jonathan to slip into the goo. But at this point, I think we all know how I feel about the goo. It's just not very consequential. Also, not the most important thing, but in Steve and Dustin's fight, Steve says this about Eddie.
Eddie wanted to play hero, and he made a dumb call, and he got himself killed.
And while he later apologizes, as far as I know, he's kinda right. I don't remember how I felt back in the day, but rewatching that sequence, Eddie really didn't need to sacrifice himself. I don't know if this is the show's way of acknowledging that critique and also saying, fuck you, it happened, we make the rules here, but I just thought that warranted a mention. These lazy character reconciliations, as well as all the contrivances, are among the many things phoned in this season. The show is more expensive than ever, and it looks worse than ever. What is this green screening? Why is this sequence edited like Taken 3? How did any of this get approved? I love when Dustin says,
"Pretty damn spectacular,"
and the view he's taking in is just dark, muddy sludge. When I was editing that moment earlier with Max, I was startled how much contrast there was a season ago compared to the flat, high high-key lighting of this season. Contrast isn't the be-all, end-all of good cinematography, but there is clear emotional intention in one of these images and not the other. Compare any two moments, and it's night and day. And when the show doesn't look flat-out amateur, the cinematography is overcompensating in intensity by shooting at a hyper-fast shutter speed. This shot of Will writhing on the ground looks like stop motion. This scene where Nancy's dispensing soap is shot like Saving Private Ryan. The dialogue is worse than ever.
Mother of God. Friends? No thanks. Best friends.
It's too big, it's not gonna fit.
Steve hears that all the time and he goes in anyway, don't you, Steve?
The editing is frankly condescending, flashing back to stuff that happened like 5 minutes ago. That I'll chalk up to the mandates of second screen entertainment, but the streaming boom that Stranger Things helped usher in is part of the reason second screen entertainment is a concept shows and movies have to take into consideration now. The ultimate display of how hollow the show has become naturally occurs in the climax. After Vecna's behavior is all attributed to the empty abstraction that is the Mind Flayer, the gang faces off against the physical manifestation of the Mind Flayer, and this sequence literally plays out, logistically and cinematically, like a cutscene introducing a Legend of Zelda boss. They talk about hit points, which only bolsters my point earlier about the Upside Down literally functioning according to the laws of physics of the games the characters play, and it's all just so empty. I guess it's a little empty when they face off against the Mind Flayer in Season 3, as goofy as it was to rip the Neverending Story song, but that emptiness is amplified here because, as I touched on when talking about the Shepherd tone, they're just recycling the same set piece and dressing it up to seem more intense, adding textures and polygons to the Mind Flayer, when it's really the exact same sequence of events. Video game comparisons get thrown around a lot as an inherent critique of certain movies, and I'm not entirely on that wavelength. For instance, I like that the Avatar movies look like video games, but watching this sequence, the climax of the entire show, my primary thought is that I'd rather be playing Shadow of the Colossus. As I also alluded to earlier, there's almost an hour's worth of resolution that comes after the climactic battle. We flash forward yet another year and a half, and for the first time in a while, the actors look almost the age their characters are meant to be. There's a bit of a mini episode baked into the resolution involving the kids' graduation, Mike getting cold feet, which seems to be intentionally playing into last episode of a sitcom tropes. That part I don't mind so much as the other last episode of a sitcom trope they borrow, which is the clip show. During the climax, and in this resolution, the show is hellbent on supercutting every iconic moment in the show to remind us how far we've come, and it's not only distracting, but I think it closes the loop on the show's nostalgia. I've spent I don't even know how long talking about the show's reverence and adherence to older media. In cannibalizing itself with all these clip show flashbacks in the finale, the show about nostalgia finally becomes nostalgic for itself. And that's maybe a cynical read, but it does make me a little sad that they feel they have to fall back so heavily on this. Something that surprised me in this last hour is that I really felt like I was gonna miss these characters. As the script tugs at all the appropriate heartstrings, however manipulative they may be, I started to feel that, I had given a part of myself to this show. As much time as I've spent complaining about it on YouTube, as much of a catastrophe as I find this season at large to be, there is a part of me that will genuinely miss the experience of watching it. The one benefit of the show taking nearly 10 years to finish up is that I can look back at each season and see a different phase of my life I was in when it came out. I can look back fondly at watching the show with friends and family, even if the Duffer Brothers monopolized my 2025 holiday season. But I think it's good to miss things. I think it's good to acknowledge that something that was a part of your life is no longer with you. And I think this profound sadness I started to feel as the finale neared its end was completely undercut by the sensation that it's not really over. These characters may be done, these actors may be moving on, and we may be saying goodbye to Hawkins, but the franchise lives on. And thinking about this was when it crystallized in my mind that it was always going to be this way. The very premise of the show, of the unrelenting saturation of 80s nostalgia, is designed so that we don't have to say goodbye to anything. So we can watch the spin-offs. We can see the Broadway show, we can read up on the extensive lore and buy the merchandise that makes us feel like the show is still alive. I mean, the final image of the entire series is a product, one that may not be on shelves as of my releasing this video, but one which certainly already has demand. After all, the more we eat, the hungrier we get. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is my third video about Stranger Things, and I think for the time you've spent watching it, I owe it to you to offer a piece of parting wisdom. You are the captain of your own ship, you can enjoy the things you want to enjoy, and you have no reason to let me stop you from doing so, but consider, if for a moment, that there is a world of new experiences out there for you, and the sooner you move past whatever comfortable piece of old media, or bygone relationship, or whatever you find yourself anchored to, the more enriched your life will become. That may sound either cheesy or downright condescending, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that we don't need Stranger Things anymore. We can be thankful for the good times and leave it at that. A recent piece of press junketry feels like the appropriate place to cap this saga off.
We're ending this series. Who cried the most? That's a good question. Yeah. Our agents.
And that's it from me this time around. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon, and links to my socials are in the description. Thanks for watching these videos, and goodbye.